Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 17 last-minute updates for the 2022 fantasy football season. Now, the entire purpose of today's video is just to give you more information. Over the course of this week, whether it's injury-related, whether it's prospects having more potential, whether it's statistics that I've gathered over the course of the week that I didn't mention in my weekly rankings videos that give me more confidence in starting a specific player, I'm going to give you guys all that information because, again, it's Week 17. The championship is on the line. We've spent over the course of the last 4 months for this singular purpose in order to capture this 2022 fantasy football championship. So over the course of today's episode, on a per matchup basis, as we talk about the remaining 15 games of Week 17, we'll talk about individual teams, individual prospects, and what information has been revealed to the public that will give us a better understanding as to how we're going to go ahead, make decisions in Week 17, and capture said 2022 fantasy football championship. Before we get into today's content, all I ask of you is to go down to the comment section. I have a pinned comment down there in order to ask you guys for your rosters going into Week 17. The reason why I want your rosters is I want to know and go ahead and put together a data sheet that gives me more information in regards to what prospects have led us to the promised land. Whether it's, teams have stud tight ends or quarterbacks, or whether they've worked off of, starting with a wide receiver early draft. I'll be able to decipher that over the course of looking at your rosters, and by doing so, it'll give me more information as to how we can approach drafts in future seasons, and also it'll give me an idea as to which prospects we truly need to step up going into Week 17. Outside of that, down in the description of the video, we do have timestamps. If you're looking for a specific player, I've timestamped specific teams, so perhaps they'll be involved in that team's overall grouping of time in which I talk about them. Perhaps if there was no information revealed about them, you can go ahead and swing on by Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. I'll have up-to-date rankings on screen like we do every Sunday morning, but this time it'll be in the new year. So for those of you who are interested and have starter sit questions going into Week 17, be sure to swing on by Sunday morning, up-to-date rankings on screen like we do every Sunday. I'll also be live streaming Saturday afternoon from 1 to 3 p.m. For those of you who are interested, starter set questions as well. Go ahead, swing on by. We'll be sure to answer any questions in regards to players that we perhaps mentioned on today's episode. All of that encompassed in tomorrow's live stream. Also, while you're down in the description of the video, perhaps looking for a specific team, you can go ahead and check out the link to PrizePicks. For those of you who haven't checked them out already, again, if you're just trying to play more daily fantasy, whether it's the NFL, the NHL, the NBA, be sure to check out PrizePicks. Again, you're picking more or less on given player statistics. You can go ahead, use promo code Andrew today when you sign up, make that first time deposit, and that first time deposit is immediately doubled up to $100. Go ahead and check that out today. Link in the description. Use promo code Andrew. Thank you very much. Also, be sure to click the like button. I appreciate it. Okay, let's talk about Week 17 matchups. Of course, we're going to begin with the Arizona Cardinals taking on the Atlanta Falcons. First and foremost, there is no weather concerns in this game because it's going to be played in a dome in Atlanta. So that's fantastic. We don't have to worry about that to begin our Sunday morning. So let's go ahead and let's begin by talking about the Arizona Cardinals going into Week 17. First and foremost, Colt McCoy is not going to be playing this week. Even though he was cleared from concussion protocols, he was experiencing more concussion-like symptoms. Therefore, he is out and not playing. His replacement will be David Blau. The last time David Blau started a game in the National Football League was 2019. And that was for the Detroit Lions. He had a 5-game stint in which he came in and relieved Matthew Stafford, who was put on the injured reserve late in that season. In the absence of Matthew Stafford, we still saw decent production from the receiving core that surrounded David Blau. One, Kenny Galladay, of course, had himself pretty good performances in those 5 remaining games, had 398 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, was still able to maintain his wide receiver 1 standing, even with the backup quarterback taking his place. But that being said, many of us are wondering, is this quarterback switch for the Arizona Cardinals going to affect our prospects, specifically someone like DeAndre Hopkins? But for those of you who haven't heard, DeAndre Hopkins unfortunately left Friday's practice early, according to Cliff Kingsbury, with a, quote, little bit of a knee issue. The fact of the matter is, this team is not obligated to play DeAndre Hopkins going into Sunday's game, especially if the knee issue that they've referred to is more serious than we think. And if it's going to be, I know that DeAndre Hopkins is a tough guy, but they may go ahead and shut him down for the remainder of the season based on the trajectory of their season, the fact that they are a 4-win football team, and the fact that winning this upcoming weekend's matchup against the Atlanta Falcons doesn't really do anything for their future. That being said, it does give potential for guys like Hollywood Brown and Greg Dortch to have more value within this matchup. That being said, Greg Dortch has had 1 good game in the last 5 weeks. Can we trust him? Maybe if you're playing in a super deep league and you're desperate, sure. But Hollywood Brown, even in the absence of a DeAndre Hopkins, if in fact we do have DeAndre Hopkins not playing, I don't even feel confident playing him. I'm currently of the mindset that outside of James Conner, Matt Prater is the only other fantasy prospect that I want to start going into Sunday's game. Now, the reason why I specifically mentioned Matt Prater is because they're in a dome. Matt Prater is coming off of 2 consecutive weeks of 14 fantasy points each game. And if they're going to go ahead and have a backup quarterback, they're going to certainly be able to move the ball, but not be able to transition into the red zone and score. It'll lead to far more field goals, and Matt Prater is certainly good at making sure those go through between the uprights. That being said, speaking of James Conner, the only other prospect that I really trust going into this upcoming weekend's matchup, assuming, of course, DeAndre Hopkins is not available due to the knee injury, James Conner over the course of the week has us a little bit worried. He did not practice Wednesday or Thursday. He got a full participation on practice on Friday. It was designated that he was dealing with a sickness illness earlier in the week, so we're good to go. Full participation, fantastic. Like I've mentioned earlier this week, in the 12 games over the course of the last 2 years that James Conner with the Arizona Cardinals has not had Chase Edmonds or Eno Benjamin in his back pocket. He's played 75% or more of the offensive snaps. The guy's averaging 20.31 half PPR fantasy points per game. That should pretty much cover it in regards to Arizona Cardinals offensive pieces. Now, when we talk about the other side of the football for the Arizona Cardinals, let's talk about their defense and how that potentially helps, the sake of one, Drake London, the thumbnail of today's video. The Arizona Cardinals DBs, Antonio Hamilton, one of their starting cornerbacks, out this week. Marco Wilson did not practice earlier today. Obviously may have had a setback due to his injury. If that's the case, he's going to also potentially be out on Sunday. Byron Murphy's been put on the injured reserve along with Budda Baker. That means 4 of their potential 5 starting secondary, DBs are out going into this given week. And how does that help Drake London? Well, Drake London has been playing extremely well and getting a lot of opportunity over the course of the last 2 weeks with Desmond Ridder. Even prior to Desmond Ridder taking over, the final week with Marcus Mariota, we still saw Drake London with 96 receiving yards. We're beginning to see a transition of this Atlanta Falcons offense to utilize him far more, but specifically in the last 2 weeks with Desmond Ridder. 20 targets, 14 receptions, 166 receiving yards. And those were against the New Orleans Saints and Baltimore Ravens. 2 secondaries that are actually really good. Now, in the case of taking on the Arizona Cardinals without their main starters, this is going to be a fantastic matchup going up ahead. We've already heard earlier this week from Arthur Smith, the head coach of the Atlanta Falcons, that the organization does not plan on sitting any of their starters. Arthur Smith specifically said that he knows that a lot of the gentlemen on his roster are fighting for jobs, whether it's within their organization or for other teams in the future. So he doesn't want to go ahead and cut them short of potential, opportunities to go ahead and prove to other teams that they deserve to be in the league. So they'll all be starting and ready to go. Now, even though we've been focused on the passing game, what the Atlanta Falcons love to do the most is, of course, run the ball. Over the course of the entire season, whether it's been with Cordero Patterson, Tyler Algier, Caleb Huntley, they have ran the ball consistently. That being said, going into this upcoming weekend's matchup, they take on the Arizona Cardinals, one of the most advantageous matchups you could possibly ask for. A team that is giving up a 4.94 yard per carry average since week 10. That's the 6th highest amongst all teams in the National Football League. Tyler Algier perfectly in a position. The only thing that I wanted to mention in regards to some of the stats that I found in him over the course of the week, Tyler Algier this season has faced the most 8 or more defenders in the box in terms of percentages amongst all running backs in the National Football League on rushing attempts. He has a higher percentage than Derrick Henry. He currently has seen 8+ defenders in the box. This is Tyler Algier, 38.55% of the time. So even with all these stacked boxes up against him, them expecting the Atlanta Falcons to certainly run the ball, this certainly does help the potential of Drake London having himself more opportunities over the middle of the field. But of course, it's another fact that gives us more confidence that no matter what they put up against this Atlanta Falcons offensive line and running game, they continue to find success. All right, that's going to cover it for this matchup. We'll go ahead and move on and let's talk about Chicago Bears versus Detroit Lions. First and foremost, let's talk about the Chicago Bears. Equanimeous St. Brown, full practice participation today. Chase Claypool questionable, and so is Dante Pettis. Dante Pettis could end up being the biggest benefactor if he is able to play, because we know that this secondary has been one of the worst in the entire National Football League, giving up the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers from weeks 10 through 16, which is 34.3 fantasy points per game. It's one of the best matchups you could possibly ask for. So if any of these wide receivers are available, they could potentially be pretty good options for fantasy purposes. It's just a matter of which one of the 3, if not Byron Pringle, be the guy that finds the end zone in this given week. Considering the instability at the position, it's probably just safer for us to just completely ignore all these receiving options unless you're in a super deep league and go for guys like Justin Fields, David Montgomery, and Cole Kmet as your primary starters within this team. Now, other information that has been revealed to us that gives us more confidence in terms of some receiving options within this team is the fact that Deshaun Elliott, the primary starting safety of the Detroit Lions, he is going to be placed on the injured reserve, which gives it us even more potential for taking the top off of an opposing defense if, in fact, one of these guys wants to go ahead and do so. That being said, we really haven't seen much utilization of that capacity over the course of the year within this offense. Also, other information regarding the Chicago Bears. Their offensive line is going to be significantly more healthy in comparison to last week. They get Tevin Jenkins and Cody Whitehair back, two offensive linemen starters that they did not have their services against the Buffalo Bills, which obviously played a big difference. After the first offensive drive for the Chicago Bears, they did not score another touchdown for the remainder of that game. I truly do believe that the offensive line makes a huge difference, especially when we're talking about moving the chains, specifically in the running game and keeping their young quarterback protected. Now, while we're on the topic of offensive line, taking on the Detroit Lions run-stopping defense, they have shown that they have been a pretty good group over the course of the last couple weeks. The Detroit Lions have really shut down a lot of running backs, but last week, they got completely torched by the efforts of Deontay Foreman, Chuba Hubbard, and that offensive line of the Carolina Panthers. When I went back and I watched that game, it was a matter of human error and bad technique, jumping the wrong gaps, and all those mistakes you could possibly make that Detroit Lions defense made. There's no telling whether they'll make those mistakes again, but at this current moment in time, I truly do believe that David Montgomery is a good play going into the given week. Now let's move on to the other side of the football. Let's talk about the defensive side of the Chicago Bears and how potentially the Detroit Lions offense will be able to take advantage of them, specifically because of their secondary. The Chicago DBs that are going to be missing in this game. We have Kindle Vildor, we have Jalen Johnson on the injured reserve, and Eddie Jackson on the injured reserve. That's three of their starting secondary members that are now on the injured reserve over the course of the last 2 weeks. Jared Goff is going to have a field day. Not only does he play at home, so there's no weather effects within this given game, but his home and away splits are ridiculous. This season, at home, 20 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. Away, 6 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. And he's only played one more game home than away. He has 8 home games and 7 away games. It is absolutely ridiculous to see the splits between those two. Jared Goff against the secondary that has not played well and is obviously not healthy and shorthanded going into the given week should be able to dominate with the forces of DJ Chark, Amon-Ra St. Brown. And even going forward within this offense, if we just go ahead and talk about the running game, Jamal Williams did not even report on the injury report this given week. He should be ready to go. As to whether or not he's going to be fantasy relevant, we're probably going to have to avoid him, even though it's a fantastic matchup. And the Chicago Bears, since week 10, are giving up 120 rushing yards per game, 1 rushing touchdown, and a 5.3 yard per carry average. It is really tough to trust anybody within this backfield, considering the overall opportunities that they're being given isn't at a high enough clip to expect a lot of success within the given matchup. Moving on, let's talk about the Jacksonville Jaguars versus Houston Texans. We have been given 100% confirmation from head coach of the Jacksonville Jaguars, which is Doug Peterson, that they are not going to be resting their players going into week 17, which is fantastic. Mainly because we were worried about them following suit in regards to what the Tennessee Titans presented on Thursday. That being said, this is a football team that since the bye week is 4-1. They want to continue to win games, continue that momentum, and another way to do so is by blowing out the Houston Texans in this given weekend's matchup. It is in a dome stadium, no weather in sight, so we don't have to really worry about that, which is fantastic. This is a team that is coming off of potentially 10 days between their last 2 games, which will be the New York Jets game of a couple Thursdays ago, and then now in which they'll be taking on the Houston Texans, which is one of the easiest matchups in terms of the running game. Hopefully, Travis Etienne will be up to the task at hand. I think Travis Etienne, Evan Ingram, they're probably the best overall plays via PrizePicks. If you go check them out, I think they'll probably go more on their fantasy point, potentially contributing to our team. So you can put together an entry in that regard. But Travis Etienne hasn't scored a touchdown since week 9. Something's got to give. I mean, I know I've said that about guys like Mike Evans, but I think there's just a higher likelihood, especially considering the matchup against Houston. But in terms of injuries, anything to report from the Jacksonville Jaguars, the only information that we know for sure is that they'll be starting their entire team. Now, when we go ahead and transition to the Houston Texans and talk about their team, they're still going to put up a fight. Over the last couple weeks, they have been really competitive with really good teams that are going to be making the playoffs. This is why this is the NFL. This is why we play on Sunday. Any given Sunday, any team can win, and they demonstrated that over the last 3 weeks. The Houston Texans beat the Tennessee Titans last week by 5 points. The week prior, they only lost to the Kansas City Chiefs by 6 points in overtime, and they only lost to the Dallas Cowboys by 4 points. Very easily could have won that game. They have played very close to 3 teams that are 2 for sure that are playoff bound, but 1 in the Tennessee Titans that very easily could be making the playoffs by week 18. All that being said, the only other players that we wanted to mention in regards to the Houston Texans is Brandon Cooks. He missed practice all week long with personal reasons. They've been designating him with NIR, which is non-injury related. Now, even though the designation is not injury related, this still could lead to him not playing in the given week. We'll have to keep an eye on that in terms of the active players on Sunday morning that are reported by the Houston Texans. But if in fact he even does play, Tyson Campbell, which will be the #1 cornerback of the Jacksonville Jaguars, has low-key been one of the better cornerbacks in the entire National Football League over the course of the season. So he'll probably pull his coverage, and it probably won't be a pretty game either way. Moving on, the next matchup I wanted to talk about, Denver Broncos taking on the Kansas City Chiefs. It'll be in Kansas City. The current weather expectation, 7-mile-per-hour winds, which is pretty light, and a 2% chance of rain. Again, overall fantastic. We'll take that. Especially considering the last couple weeks of weather, this is perfect. Now let's go ahead and let's primarily focus on the Denver Broncos. First and foremost, in this post-Nathaniel Hackett era, we've seen a lot of players over the last couple of days via social media come out and, give their support for Russell Wilson. This is going to be a really make or break kind of week, mainly because their efforts are going to really give us an indication as to how much they truly do believe in Russell Wilson. Hopefully this team is going to go out, put forward their best foot. Going into this given week, Greg Dulcich is already out. He is going to be placed on the injured reserve. Jerry Jeudy has been hit with a questionable tag, along with Kendall Hinton, another one of their starting wide receivers that has been in the rotation over the course of the last couple of weeks. Both those wide receivers are expected to play, which is fantastic. Now, another piece of information that we want to talk about is this Denver Broncos backfield. With Chase Edmonds back and in the rotation, I know Chase Edmonds primarily played a lot last week because of the blowout and the nature of that game, but we're still going to see him dig into Latavius Murray's work, along with Marlon Mack still being an active participant. So if a lot of people are going to be digging into Latavius Murray's overall workload, it does make him a little bit lesser of an option in my mind as a running back who is an RB3 player that has RB2 upside if in fact he is able to find the end zone. So at this current moment in time, kind of staying away from that. We'll go ahead and demonstrate that with the rankings that I present on Sunday morning. That being said, the last time these two teams played, the Denver Broncos put up 28 points. If we're able to see Russ Cook in some sort of capacity with Jerry Jeudy, Cortland Sutton healthy, ready to go, I think those two pieces, specifically those two wide receivers, are the most valuable prospects and probably the only ones that I feel comfortable starting in this given week. Now, when we talk about the Kansas City Chiefs, specifically, we have information today that, according to Andy Reid, we will not be seeing Mecole Hardman on Sunday. He has been dealing with a little bit of a groin injury that he has now recently had and has set him back over the course of the last couple weeks, so he will not be probably playing until the playoffs. So really what that does is gives more opportunities for Jerick McKinnon. Jerick McKinnon has been a monster. 6 total touchdowns in the course of the last 4 games that he has played. With that being the case, he's pretty much kind of taken over the role of Mecole Hardman, especially down in the red zone as a receiving threat that really is able to get the job done after the catch. Over the course of the last 4 games in specific, Jerick McKinnon has played 138 total snaps, while Isaiah Pacheco has played 107 of the total snaps. If you go ahead and look at the total snaps in comparison to touches, even though Isaiah Pacheco has played significantly less snaps, in fact, 31 less snaps, he has a total of 4 more touches than Jerick McKinnon. The only difference maker in terms of fantasy point contribution is receptions, which is a huge difference maker in a half or full PPR scoring format, and the fact that he has 5 receiving touchdowns and 1 rushing touchdown. That's the biggest difference maker. Otherwise, in a matchup up against the Denver Broncos, who just got torched by a guy like Cam Akers, there's a very good opportunity for a running back like Isaiah Pacheco to put forth a fantastic effort and honestly put together a great performance. It's just a matter of whether he finds the end zone as to whether or not he's going to be that RB2 upside play, while we pretty much already automatically expect Jerick McKinnon to not only be able to get himself red zone utilization, but enough receiving work to keep him in that RB2 conversation going into the week. The final thing I wanted to mention in regards to this matchup is the fact that the Kansas City Chiefs have won the last 14 straight matchups against the Denver Broncos. Should be a pretty easy week for them going into the contest. Moving on, let's talk about the Miami Dolphins traveling up to Foxborough to play the New England Patriots. The Miami Dolphins have a couple questions in regards to injuries. Of course, we already know that Tua Tagovailoa is going to be out, but we're not 100% certain as to whether or not Terron Armstead, their starting left tackle, is going to be active. He did not practice all week long, which is very worrisome, and with a did not participate, kind of designation, it leans us into believing that he most likely will not play. So with that being said, let's talk about Teddy Bridgewater. Without a starting left tackle, his blind side available, and we know some of the other offensive linemen on this team have been banged up. Eichenberg is going to be coming back from the injured reserve. He may be starting. We'll have to wait and see, based on the designation on Sunday morning of Terron Armstead. But ultimately, can Teddy Bridgewater allow the receiving threats of this offense to be relevant in fantasy? We talked about it a little bit earlier this week. In the game earlier this season where Teddy Bridgewater, and as the starting quarterback of this team, took on the Minnesota Vikings, Tyreek Hill 12 catches, 177, Waddle 6 catches, 129, Mike Gesicki in that game, 6 catches, 69, 2 touchdowns. Again, Tyreek Hill taking on the New England Patriots. Over the course of the 5 games that he's taken on this defense in his career, 19.48 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format, while Waddle against the New England Patriots in the last 3 contests is averaging 13.67 half PPR fantasy points per game. We have seen a lot of success. Not only that, if in fact Teddy Bridgewater is more inclined to target Mike Gesicki within this offense, I mean, to be honest, I truly do believe that Tua, when he looks down the field, he does not see Mike Gesicki. He's quite literally invisible to him. That's why he only gets like 1 or 2 catches a week over the course of the entirety of this season. So if in fact Teddy Bridgewater can bring back life to Mike Gesicki, I know it's a very risky play, but just putting it out there, the New England Patriots versus the tight end position, most recently against Las Vegas, gave up 5 catches, 68 and a touchdown against Minnesota, 7 catches, 63 and a touchdown against Cincinnati, 8 catches for 40 yards just this last week. Not a bad upside play if in fact you're desperate at tight end. Now, if you're still not convinced about the potential of starting one of these fantasy prospects with Teddy Bridgewater, let's go ahead and remind you that the New England Patriots have been dealing with a lot of injuries in the secondary. To specify exactly who is going to be out or potentially questionable this weekend, let's give you some names. Jack Jones, one of their starting cornerbacks, out. Marcus Jones, another one of their DBs, out. Jalen Mills is questionable to potentially play. Missed a couple practices already this week. And Jonathan Jones is also questionable to play. If in fact we end up seeing all 4 of those guys miss this given week, it's going to make Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, Mike Gesicki even better plays within the given week. I trust all of them potentially. Moving on, let's talk about the New England Patriots. Now, outside of the information that we've been given in terms of injuries, where Devontae Parker is going to be missing along with Jonnu Smith, we know that Ramondre Stevenson and Hunter Henry are both questionable. Both those guys are expected to play. That's a given. But the fact that we do not have Devontae Parker active in the lineup does give a lot more credence to potentially playing Kendrick Bourne. Kendrick Bourne in week 16, just a week ago, 6 catches, 129 total yards, 1 touchdown, and 21.9 half PPR fantasy points. Over the course of the last 2 seasons, 2021 and 2022, with the New England Patriots, in games in which Kendrick Bourne has had 4 more receptions, that's happened 11 total times. He's averaging 12.98 half PPR fantasy points per game. Honestly, not a bad option, especially considering Xavier Howard, the number 1 cornerback of the Miami Dolphins, is currently dealing with an injury, did not practice on Friday, and if in fact he is going to miss, it'll potentially make Kendrick Bourne a honest, flexible option going into the given matchup within the week. I truly do believe that typically Ramondre Stevenson will be the only startable option within the New England Patriots offense, but in a full PPR format in a deeper league, I wouldn't mind Kendrick Bourne if Xavier Howard is out, and even if he's active, he hasn't been playing well this season, so you technically could still play Kendrick Bourne. Moving on, let's talk about the Indianapolis Colts taking on the New York Giants. The Indianapolis Colts have a couple players that have already been designated out, Ashton Dulin and Kylan Granson, 2 offensive players, 1 wide receiver, 1 tight end. Those guys aren't really contributors within this offense, and quite frankly, just to be honest across the board, the only fantasy prospect within this offense that I can trust, and I will be starting this weekend in any of my leagues, is Michael Pittman Jr. That's it. I will not be starting any of the running backs. I truly do not trust this offense to do the right thing. Therefore, the only reason I want to talk about the Indianapolis Colts is for Michael Pittman Jr. We know for a fact that Adoree Jackson has been limited at practice all week long. He has missed, I would say, the last 5 consecutive games. So if in fact we're going to see Adoree Jackson return, it could play a huge difference maker as to whether or not we want to start someone like Michael Pittman Jr. Would probably lead me away from starting him. But the fact of the matter is, Adoree Jackson has been hit with the doubtful tag. So the chances of him playing are very unlikely. Therefore, Michael Pittman Jr. joins another group of wide receivers that have found a lot of success while Adoree Jackson has been missing. Since his absence, number 1 wide receivers against this New York Giants defense in terms of statistics that they have produced against them. CeeDee Lamb, 6 catches, 106. Jahan Dotson, 5 catches, 54 and a touchdown. Terry McLaurin, 8 catches, 105 and a touchdown. Devontae Smith, 5 catches, 64 and a touchdown. A.J. Brown, 4 catches, 70 and a touchdown. Jahan Dotson again, 4 catches, 105 and a touchdown. McLaurin, 6 for 70. And then most recently, Justin Jefferson, 12 catches, 133 and a touchdown. Wide receivers have dominated against the secondary over the course of the last, I would say 2 months now, with Adoree Jackson out. And if he's going to be out once again, Michael Pittman Jr. could be of value. Now, when we talk about the New York Giants, even though their secondary has been a little bit beat up, so has the Indianapolis Colts. Most recently, Kenny Moore has been designated out going into this given week. He's their primary nickel. And Isaiah Rodgers, one of the better coverage corners in terms of the National Football League, outside of someone like Stephon Gilmore in the secondary, is also going to be out. He's specifically being placed on the injured reserve. That is Isaiah Rodgers. So what this does is gives us more and more confidence into playing Richie James Jr. and Isaiah Hodgins. Richie James Jr., who will typically be going up against the nickel corner, considering he plays 84% of his offensive snaps this season in the slot position in 4 out of his last 6 games. 12 plus fantasy points and a half PPR scoring format, 12.3, 12.6, 15.6, 13.0. Great performances. I expect another big performance out of Richie James Jr. against this secondary that is certainly shorthanded. Another player, Isaiah Hodgins, who over the course of the last month has been a fantastic fantasy option for many of us. In 3 out of his last 4 performances, 12 plus fantasy points. Those contributions are 12.9, 13.8, and 18.1 most recently against the Minnesota Vikings. He is playing 91% of his snaps out wide. So you may be thinking, well, Angie, wouldn't Stephon Gilmore potentially cover him? No, Stephon Gilmore is going to be on Darius Slayton, who is the primary number one wide receiver within this offense. This offense runs 3 wide receiver sets about 80% of the time over the course of the last month. So if, in fact, we're going to see all 3 of these guys on the field, we're going to see Darius Slayton pulling the number 1 coverage, which will give more and more opportunity for Richie James Jr. and Isaiah Hodgins, both guys that are coming off a week with double-digit targets, to have themselves another great performance that pretty much locks it up for the New York Giants in their potential information. Moving on, let's talk about the New Orleans Saints taking on the Philadelphia Eagles. A couple of pieces of information in regards to injuries. Alvin Kamara, even though he did not practice all week long, got a full participation in practice on Friday. Good to go. Chris Olave is still questionable to play. Whether or not he plays, again, it's still up in the air. We know that Andreas Pete, their offensive guard, he's going to be out going into the given week, and that certainly doesn't help considering their interior, their offensive line has already been beat up because a couple weeks back, Cesar Ruiz, their primary starting center, went to the injured reserve. So with 2 of their starting interior offensive linemen out, it does not make it that enticing, especially playing up against, Linval Joseph, Ndamukong Suh, Jordan Davis, who have played extremely well in terms of interior defensive linemen. Jordan Hargrave, they still have Fletcher Cox, Brandon Graham. There are so many great defensive linemen rotating for the Philadelphia Eagles. It makes it that much more difficult to potentially trust the running game of Alvin Kamara. But that being said, Alvin Kamara can still get it done through the air. But we're going to have to wait and see how they want to utilize him. Really hasn't been playing much through the air, like I mentioned on Tuesday's episode. In terms of third down snaps, in comparison to last season, it's about a 20% drop in terms of overall snap counts on third down. Now, other options within this offense, like we mentioned a little bit ago, Chris Olave. If, in fact, he is active and ready to play, we know for a fact that Avonte Maddox, the primary nickel for the Philadelphia Eagles, he is out, and C.D. Gardner-Johnson, he is moving to the injured reserve. So if, in fact, we're going to be in a situation where Chris Olave is active, perhaps move him into the slot position a little bit more so he can get away from guys like Darius Slay and Bradbury. Perhaps Chris Olave could be a decent play. Outside of that, we'll have to then potentially look towards the services of Marquez Callaway as a potential flex option if, in fact, we're looking for a slot receiver to benefit from Avonte Maddox's overall absence within the given week. Outside of that information, we move on to the Philadelphia Eagles, which we've been given confirmation that Jalen Hurts will not be playing in this given week. In fact, not only is he going to be missing, so is Lane Johnson. So with those 2 players out, we know that there's a for sure designation that we got a full practice out of Miles Sanders, so we don't have to worry about that. We know that Gardner Minshew is going to be the starting quarterback. Not really worried about this in any sort of capacity. Over the course of the last 13 starts that he has had, 11 of those games are 2 or more touchdowns. That's fantastic. We saw the utilization that he had with A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith last week. The fact that those 2 wide receivers can still stay relevant with a backup quarterback is fantastic. Just speaks to the offense, speaks to how well this entire scheme has been built by Nick Sirianni going into this upcoming weekend's matchup. We know that for sure Marcus May is going to be out. Marshawn Lattimore, who's been questionable all week long with limited practices, could end up missing. If Marshawn Lattimore does end up playing and going up against a guy like A.J. Brown, this could be an even bigger week for Devonta Smith. Last week, had himself 2 receiving touchdowns in the red zone. In terms of total targets, we saw Devonta Smith have 3 total targets within the red zone, 2 of those leading to a touchdown. Only A.J. Brown had 1. Unfortunate, but no other receiving option within this overall offense had a red zone target. Those are the 2 guys that he is looking towards. Those 2 should be pretty good options in terms of fantasy going into this week, as you know. Moving on. Let's talk about the Carolina Panthers taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Here's the fact of the matter. Outside of DJ Moore, really, there's nobody else in terms of receiver or tight end that I trust within this offense. So luckily, Carlton Davis is doubtful to play, and if that's going to be the case, that really does help DJ Moore in his overall potential. We know that Jamel Dean is questionable to play, and Antoine Winfield Jr. is also questionable to play, both of them being limited throughout the week of practice. But we know that DJ Moore, over the course of the last month, 3 of the last 4 performances that he has had with Sam Darnold have consisted of 15 or more half PPR fantasy points. Incredible production. We'd love to see it. We know that we're going to see Vita Vea potentially returning, even though he was limited all week of practice. It doesn't really bother me in regards to Foreman and Hubbard. We know that the amount of opportunity that are being given on a weekly basis and the fact that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers lack offense will keep them in the matchup and will keep the running game alive and those opportunities going. And eventually they'll break off a couple runs because they know how to run the ball in Carolina. Been one of the better run blocking teams since the absence of Christian McCaffrey being traded from that organization. Now, when I talk about the lack of offense from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, I'm specifically mentioning the fact that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have not scored more than 24 points in a singular game outside of the one time that they took on the Kansas City Chiefs earlier this season. And they actually gave up 50 plus points and were able to score 31 somehow because, again, it was garbage time majority of the way. Outside of that given instance, they haven't scored more than 24 points in any other game this season. And over the course of the last 4 weeks with Sam Darnold, the Carolina Panthers have put up 23, 30, 16, and 37 points in the last 4 games. This is going to be a close matchup. We'll keep the run game relevant, so I'm not worried about the running backs in Carolina. Neither am I, too worried about DJ Moore and his potential going up against a pretty injured secondary of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, when we talk about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, what is their overall potential? With J.C. Horn out, we know for a fact that Mike Evans will have a little bit more upside potentially in this given week. Even though, like I mentioned on Wednesday's episode with Mike Evans, the fact that he is on pace to have his career high with Tom Brady in terms of total targets, receptions, and receiving yards over the course of the last 3 years with Tom Brady in specific, it doesn't really make a difference if he's not scoring touchdowns. Hopefully, he'll be able to find the end zone, considering over the course of the last, 5-6 games against the Carolina Panthers, Mike Evans is averaging over 15 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. That's the hope. We know that Donovan Smith, our left tackle, is going to be returning after missing last week. Obviously, the left tackle of last week's game got injured. There's going to be an entire conversation as to whether or not that week off is going to help Donovan Smith. But the fact of the matter is, as long as you keep pressure out of Brady's face, that's going to help the receiving threats of this offense. It'll certainly help the running game as long as these guys are healthy, especially considering it seems like Leonard Fournette is healthy in his own right. He did mention on Twitter last week that he was dealing with a Liz Frank earlier in the season. That may be something that is still lingering, but based on the fact that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers gave this man 30 opportunities and 29 touches against the Arizona Cardinals, leads me to believe that Leonard Fournette is back, ready to go, and healthier than ever. Moving on, let's talk about the Cleveland Browns taking on the Washington Commanders. This is going to be a very interesting matchup. The weather is not going to play much of a factor, quite frankly. 0% chance of rain, 6-mile-per-hour winds. Honestly, it's going to be cold, but it's not going to be that big of a factor within the overall matchup. So let's talk about a couple players via the Cleveland Browns. Amari Cooper, NIR, non-injury related. That's why he missed practice all week long. Not worried about him. He's going to be ready to go. Jedrick Wills, their starting left tackle, was able to get a limited practice by Friday, which gives him a very good chance for playing on Sunday. That being said, the only other thing that I wanted to mention regarding the Cleveland Browns, considering they've stayed relatively healthy and there isn't any new information, is the fact that over the course of the week, I found that Deshaun Watson was able to throw 3 passes last week, which were all dropped passes by Amari Cooper, David Njoku, and Donovan Peoples-Jones individually. 3 different passes that could have led to touchdowns. If, in fact, those lead to touchdowns, again, Deshaun Watson's far more fantasy relevant. There's a reason why I truly do believe he could be fantasy relevant within this given week as his top 16, 17 option. So keep an eye out for that for those of you who are desperate at quarterback. Outside of that, let's talk about the other side of the football. Carson Wentz taking on the Cleveland Browns. Carson Wentz has been named the starter. In the last 6 performances as a starter, 3 of those games over 20 fantasy points, 3 of those games less than 10 fantasy points. Very volatile. I truly don't believe that this is going to affect specifically Carson Wentz in this given week to a factor where he's going to be a completely nullified quarterback, because the wide receivers that surround him, in the case of Terry McLaurin, Jahan Dotson, and Curtis Samuel, are all going to be relevant. Now, specifically, McLaurin and Dotson, I don't expect them to change in terms of their overall opportunities and contributions. I do expect to see more utilization out of Curtis Samuel based on the relationship that we saw between Curtis Samuel and Carson Wentz early in the season from weeks 1 through 6 prior to Carson Wentz going to the injured reserve. In those 6 games, Curtis Samuel's contributions, half PPR fantasy, 15.2, 19.4, 9.6, 5.8, 9.2. Overall, pretty good performances across the board there when Carson Wentz has been healthy. Other pieces of information in regards to this offense is the fact that Antonio Gibson, one of their running backs, is not going to be playing this week. He is out. Brian Robinson should have this backfield all to himself. We know that Jonathan Williams is going to get himself into the rotation, but understand that the reason why Jonathan Williams played 20 snaps last week was mainly because Brian Robinson didn't play the last 11 minutes of that San Francisco 49ers game because of the blowout. So it's going to be all Brian Robinson all day against the Cleveland Browns run-stopping defense that has been atrocious this season. Over the course of the last, I'd say 6-7 games here, Brian Robinson has been incredible. From weeks 10 through 16, the guy's been averaging 19 rushing attempts per game, 90 total yards per game, and 11.48 fantasy points per game. Taking on Cleveland will only heighten those overall potential numbers, especially with the absence of Antonio Gibson. Taking on New Orleans, who just ran for 27 attempts, 92 yards, and a touchdown with their running backs. Baltimore, 21 for 183. Cincinnati, 19 for 120 and a touchdown. This defense since week 10 is giving up 131 rushing yards per game to opposing running backs, which is a 5.61 yard per carry average. Fantastic upside for Brian Robinson. Moving on, let's talk about the San Francisco 49ers taking on the Las Vegas Raiders. We're almost done, ladies and gentlemen. We got a lot more teams to talk about, but hey, this is exciting news because we have to get our lineups ready to go. So let's talk about the San Francisco 49ers. We've been given specific information that Deebo Samuel will not be playing until the NFL playoffs. Good to know. Fantastic. At least we have an idea instead of hoping that he'll potentially play, even though he was at practice and some sort of way participating, but not at a heavy extent. That being said, the San Francisco 49ers do not really need him. Over the course of the last 4 games, they have scored 30-plus points 3 of those 4 games. And the only game in which they didn't score over 30 points was a Thursday night football game on a short week against his division rivals. So, quite frankly, I'm expecting this team to drop 30 more potential points against a Las Vegas Raiders defense that has struggled all season long. Now, speaking of the Las Vegas Raiders, let's talk about what they've done over the course of this week. They've benched Derek Carr, which is obviously going to ensure that they don't have to pay him any money in case he gets hurt in the next couple games. But that definitely does isolate Devontae Adams, who really only came to the Raiders to play with his best friend. And it obviously is going to kind of, shift this locker room into a position where, again, they know that they don't want to win games anymore. Why does Josh Jacobs need to put his body on the line? He was already very confrontational with his post-game interview last time out, in which he was really, criticizing the entire organization, their play calling, the way that this team has produced over the course of the year. With all that heavy criticism, it does lead me to believe that I don't really want to start Devontae Adams and or Josh Jacobs in this given week. I think the most relevant options might end up being Matt Collins and Hunter Renfrow, maybe Darren Waller, if in fact Jarrett Stidham of all quarterbacks can look in his direction. Let's not forget the last time the Las Vegas Raiders had a game in which they really could not move the ball. It was earlier this season, week 7, against the New Orleans Saints. They didn't move the ball past the 50-yard line once. This could be another one of those games. In that game, they lost 24-0. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a goose egg out of the Las Vegas Raiders. They got a pretty good kicker, so all they really have to do is get past the 50-yard line, and Carlson can get it done. But how many times are they going to be able to do so against one of the best defenses, if not the best defense in the league? Moving on, the Jets versus the Seattle Seahawks. This is what I call the Geno Smith revenge game. Is it really a revenge game? I don't know, but let's talk about the Jets first and foremost. Mike White will be back and active. In the last 2 starts that Mike White had, he had 101 passing attempts and 0 passing touchdowns. There are going to be passing touchdowns from the direction of Mike White to his overall receiving options. As to who's going to be catching the ball, the expectation is that Garrett Wilson is going to be the number 1. Garrett Wilson, in the last couple games where Mike White was a starting quarterback, specifically was averaging 10 targets per game, 6.3 receptions, 112 receiving yards, and 0.67 receiving touchdowns, which is 18.3 half PPR fantasy points per game. Of course, Garrett Wilson's an automatic. As for the other 2, Corey Davis and or Elijah Moore, really, Corey Davis is probably the next man up, but I don't trust either of those 2 in a fantasy championship kind of environment. Now, when we talk about Zonovan Knight, is he going to be relevant? Can we trust him? Let's just put it this way. In the 2 games in which, or actually in the 3 games in which Zonovan Knight played with Mike White, 11.8, 14.3, 14.7, relevant in all 3 of them. Now, in the 2 games that he played with Zach Wilson as the starting quarterback, 2.3 and 1.8. Is there a correlation there? Potentially. Zach Wilson is so bad, all the defenses do is stack the box and stop the run. If, in fact, you get Mike White back out there slinging the rock, we may be in a conversation where even though Zonovan Knight isn't going to be given majority of the receiving work, that'll probably go in the direction of Michael Carter, Zonovan Knight's still a relevant back within the matchup, especially considering the Seattle Seahawks give up the most fantasy points to opposing running backs since week 10. Let's move on to the Seattle Seahawks side of the ball, where we've been given information in regards to today. Tyler Lockett is expected to play. He did have himself a participation of walkthroughs over the course of the week. Now, even though he is only 1 week removed from finger surgery, there's a lot of hope that if, in fact, he's active and ready to go, the last 6 straight games for Tyler Lockett have just been automatic touchdowns prior to this injury. So if, in fact, he's going to continue that streak of games of scoring touchdowns, why not this week against the New York Jets? While, of course, Sauce Gardner will be all over DK Metcalf. Outside of that, Kenneth Walker, who missed Wednesday's practice, was able to participate the last 2 days and is expected to play. No worries there. Moving on. Let's talk about the Minnesota Vikings taking on the Green Bay Packers. The Minnesota Vikings will have Garrett Bradbury, their starting center, out. That will give a little bit more potential pressure up front, but ultimately, this Minnesota Vikings will not be able to be stopped. The Green Bay Packers defense is their biggest weakness overall. But luckily for the Green Bay Packers, the Minnesota Vikings like to play close games. The Minnesota Vikings this season set the NFL record for most games won by a singular score, which is 11. If they're going to keep this game close, of course, we know that Justin Jefferson is going to be able to ball out. The last 2 games against this defense has put up over 160 plus receiving yards and 2 touchdowns in each of those games. There's going to be a lot of production there. As soon as the defense kind of locks in on Justin Jefferson. TJ Hawkinson's probably the next man up. Of course, we're going to see a lot of production out of the likes of someone like Dalvin Cook, but those 3 options are probably the 3 primaries outside of course, Kirk Cousins being starting options. So 4 starting options from the side of the Minnesota Vikings. Not really any other injury information in regards to that team. But on the other side of this matchup, we have a little bit of injury news. Christian Watson limited on Friday. The head coach said that we'll see as to whether his status is going to be available and or inactive by Sunday. David Bakhtiari expected to play coming back from his appendicitis. And of course, Aaron Jones expected to play despite limited practices all week long. Now, a couple pieces of information that I want to talk about. If Christian Watson is active, you got to remember the Minnesota Vikings are giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers since week 10 in terms of half PPR fantasy points scored, which is 35.71 per week. They're giving up about 17 receptions per game, 220 receiving yards per game, and 0.86 receiving touchdowns per game to opposing wide receivers. If Watson's inactive, Lazard steps up and is a great play. Let's talk about Aaron Jones. Aaron Jones, in the last 6 healthy games that he has played, is averaging 18.57 half PPR fantasy points per game. I'm expecting him to be healthy, active, and play well, especially against the Minnesota Vikings of all defenses. That being said, I did have A.J. Dillon ranked relatively high this week. So with that being in the entire, kind of conversation, I truly do believe both these running backs must be started. They're both players that are going to be relevant, especially considering the fact that A.J. Dillon over the course of the last 4 games has scored 5 touchdowns and is averaging 17.03 half PPR fantasy points per game. And in the last 3 games that he's taken on the Minnesota Vikings, the guy has not produced less than 12 half PPR fantasy points in each of those games. One of those earlier this season in which he scored 17.6 fantasy points and is getting himself ample enough receiving utilization to still be relevant even if he doesn't find the end zone and still be an 8 to 10 point player at the running back position. Moving on. The battle for LA. We have the Los Angeles Rams taking on the Los Angeles Chargers. Here's the fact of the matter. There really hasn't been any sort of shift in terms of injuries within this organization. We know for a fact that Austin Eckler is going to be active, ready to go, had a full participation in practice on Friday. We have the reactivation from the injured reserve of Joey Bosa. He's back, ready to go. Derwin James knocked himself out of that game on Monday night with a concussion. Obviously, it's a little bit of a shorter week. He's not going to be available. That definitely does help the likes of Tyler Higbee. But outside of that, there really isn't anything within this matchup that is new information. We know that we're going to play our studs in regards to Tyler Higbee. We know we're going to play Cam Akers on the Los Angeles Rams side of the ball. Keenan Allen, Austin Eckler must start within the Los Angeles Chargers side of the ball. Mike Williams can be a toss-up in that regard considering the difficult matchup against Jalen Ramsey. But outside of that, we know that the Los Angeles Chargers like to play close games similar to the Minnesota Vikings. No matter how good or bad a team is, they're going to play it close. So we're going to probably be in a situation where this will be a little bit of a closer game than we anticipate. Moving on. The Pittsburgh Steelers versus the Baltimore Ravens. This is the Sunday night football game, which is interestingly enough going to be a game in which it probably is a lower scoring game. The only, couple prospects that may be available in your overall leagues are these 2 defenses. If they are, could be of value this week. We know that Lamar Jackson's out. We know that Marcus Peters out. We know that Calais Campbell is questionable, may end up missing another consecutive week here for the Baltimore Ravens. Does that really make a difference? Marcus Peters, the last time they took on the Pittsburgh Steelers, was primarily covering Deontay Johnson. That could help Deontay Johnson's overall upside within this given week if a backup corner is going to be covering him. Not only that, we know that George Pickens is probably going to see the coverage of Marlon Humphreys. If that coverage is pivoted in the direction of Deontay Johnson, George Pickens could be a great play. We're just going to have to wait and see how that transpires. But outside of that, no real, potential news between these 2 teams of anything else that has transpired over the course of the week. Let's move on to the final matchup. We have the Buffalo Bills taking on the Cincinnati Bengals. This should be one of the most exciting matchups of the week. And luckily, it is a Monday night matchup that many of us will have to kind of rely upon because this is going to be a higher scoring game in my mind. As of right now, 10-mile-per-hour winds, which is medium, and 20% chance of precipitation, which quite frankly is majority of that in the second half. So if in fact we're going to get into a situation where it's still going to rain in the second half, I expect these 2 teams to be able to pass the ball consistently. Even if they don't, so be it. They got decent running back options, and at least both these quarterbacks have the mobility aspect to be able to run the ball and find value in that regard. We know that Hayden Hurst, at full participation of practice all week long. Fantastic. We love to see that. And Jordan Poyer did not practice due to a knee injury all week long. The Buffalo Bills not having one of their captors and one of their better defensive backs out there for Monday night certainly will play a difference. But again, they play on Monday. They have an extra day to recover. Maybe Jordan Poyer will be active. We'll have to wait and see. That's going to cover it for me today. Thank you everybody for watching. Those are our last minute updates going into week 17 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you like today's episode, be sure to click the like button. Join us. Whether it's, whether you're watching this on Saturday, potentially on Sunday, we'll have to wait and see. Be sure to join us on Saturday, 1 to 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. We'll be live streaming here on the channel. And on Sunday morning from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Again, that'll be in the morning on the new year. with up-to-date rankings ready to go, give you guys all that information to set your lineups and win a 2022 Fantasy Football Championship. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't yet already. Be sure to check out PrizePicks and use promo code Andrew today. Outside of that, until tomorrow, guys, I'll see you. Peace.